Night after night, the first people to lift their eyes to the vault above saw not a ceiling, but a living grammar of lights, a cold language that seemed to speak in patterns of harvest and ruin, war and kingship, birth and plague. And in that silent grammar, they detected not comfort, but a presence that judged, punished, and occasionally spared, if only you read it in time. The mind relaxes into darkness, but the body does not, and ancient towns without lamps lay open to the river of the heavens, every star like a watcher, every wandering planet like an inspector moving contrary to the crowd. And in the tremor of uncertainty, the idea was born that the sky was not simply there. It was addressing you with rules that you could obey or break. On the floodplains of Sumer and Akkad, where the rivers wrote their own calendars with silt, priest astronomers climbed brick steps to temple roofs and made lists of what the sky did, clay tablets incised with warnings and cross-references. A catalog later known to scholars as Enuma Anu Enlil, a meticulous ledger in which a king's fate might hang upon whether Venus appeared thin or thick, whether a halo ringed the moon, whether Mars lingered in a forbidden house, and fear sharpened the stylus. They divided the sky into omens the way a field is divided into furrows, and in their system, nothing was random, because randomness would mean the gods were asleep, and if the gods slept, cities died. So every eclipse became a sentence, every comet a march of soldiers in the air, every unusual dawn a portent that, if anticipated, could be managed, and if misread, could drown a dynasty. In Egypt, where the horizon was a clean line and the river rose to a rhythm, fear had a different diet, for the sun that sustained the kingdom also sailed a nightly underworld, menaced by the serpent Apophis, and the simple act of sunrise was a victory won by unseen labor that could fail at any moment if rituals faltered, a precarious balance that made even the regular helical rising of Sirius, so welcome to farmers, feel like one more test to pass. Temple ceilings became maps of the upper Nile of stars, painted with golden boats and decans, the 36 star groups that rose one after another to measure the hours of darkness. And as the priests watched each decan lift, they were keeping a vigil, not just against the spread of chaos on Earth, but against a cosmic thief who might steal the day itself. So their vigilance was not an act of wonder alone, but a hedge against catastrophe. In the cities of the Yellow River, records of guest stars and broom stars were kept with austere precision, and an empire's reputation for cosmic harmony could be bruised by an eclipse that arrived unannounced. So rumor said that court astronomers could lose not only their positions, but their heads if the shadow came without warning, a chilling incentive to listen hard to the murmur of the sky. To a court that believed heaven granted or revoked the mandate to rule, a comet's untimely tale was like a writ against the throne, and by naming it, charting it, and explaining it, officials hoped to transmute doom into admonition and admonition into a calendar correction, a ritual, a sacrifice, or the removal of a minister, because fear could be redirected if it could be described. Further west, when the Greeks charted constellations and noted the slow crawl of the equinoxes, they built philosophies around eternal cycles, but they did not dissolve dread. They refined it, imagining cosmic fires that periodically burned the world clean in a stoic conflagration. Time as a wheel whose spokes kept returning to a point of crisis one could sense in the shifting architecture of the sky. The Romans, inheritors of both augury and imperial anxiety, felt the chill of comets pass through marble and laurel alike, branding certain nights with sudden, hair-like stars that were read aloud as messages about Caesars and civil wars. And even when the state refused to tremble, the populace would look up and remember that the ceiling had torn and a draft had entered, and drafts are how sickness spreads. Across oceans, in the jungled plazas of the Maya, the planet we call Venus was more than a bright pinprick. It was a clock with sharp teeth, its cycles tabulated in codices for decades, its risings woven into the rhythms of war and offerings, because fear thrives on regularity, and to know when dread will peak is a kind of power that fascinates even as it terrifies. Wherever people stood, they noticed that the night was not one thing, but a collection of rules that could be learned and sometimes moved, and the guardians of those rules, cloaked as priests or officials or quiet observatories on temple roofs, carried a weight that was more than scholarly, because they did not simply observe fate, they negotiated with it. The fear of stars was not a child's panic at darkness. It was the apprehension of accountability before a court without walls, and it fused with law, agriculture, war, and art, until entire cities breathed with the anxiety of whether the next eclipse would bite deep, or whether the planets would conjoin in unlucky houses, or whether a blue-white stranger would tear a stitch in the tapestry and let cold pour in. This was not superstition alone, nor was it science alone, but a hybrid organism grown from nights of listening and centuries of remembering. And if the sky seemed to demand deference, it also seemed to offer something in return, if only you had the nerve to ask what it wanted. To glimpse a comet without warning was to feel history accelerate, and the ancients called them broom stars, because they seemed to sweep clean what stood before them. But purification in that sense meant the clearing of rulers, cities, or rules. And so, in the appearance of a wandering plume, they saw both an indictment and a schedule for correction. Roman poets likened the Codice Iulium, the comet that blazed after Caesar's death, to the soul of the slain dictator rising to join the gods. But beneath the poetry was policy. For if the star could be claimed by one house, it could stabilize or destabilize an empire, and the sky became a field where reputations were harvested with telescopic scythes no one owned, yet everyone feared. In the courts of the Qin and Han, where immortality was pursued in the strange mixture of alchemy and administration, records of eclipses and comets were bound to edicts and rituals. And if a plume tore across the heavens, ministers might be dismissed, reforms announced, or sacrifices ordered, because if the cosmos had sent a memorandum, no bureaucrat wished to be seen ignoring it. The Maya watched Venus with a patience that bordered on obsession, not out of shallow fixation, but because their kingship seemed braided to its motions, and in the Dresden Codex, a table of Venus cycles is inscribed with omens of harm and advantage, the bright star serving as both a clock and a blade, and in the anxiety of its first appearance in the morning sky, warriors timed their campaigns in a choreography of dread. Among the Mexica, the dread took on the shape of star demons, tame, hungering for the heart of the sun during eclipses, prowling the liminal hours when day faltered, and people shuttered their homes while priests climbed to the heights to keep the world alive with offerings. Because in liminality, there is always the fear that the necessary passage will become a permanent residence. If the night sky seemed to threaten, it also offered a timetable by which to avert threat. And across cultures, one sees astronomer priests measuring angular distances, noting dates, anticipating alignments, because to predict is to prepare, and to prepare is to domesticate a little of the unknown, while retaining a respectful distance from a force that never bows. Fear and calendar kept each other fed, and when processions shifted the meeting place of sun and stars century by century, altars found themselves out of sync with their patrons, And somewhere between discomfort and catastrophe, ritual schedules slipped. The rains misbehaved, fields failed, and it would have felt as though the cosmos had moved its address without leaving a forwarding message. Hipparchus named that slow wobble, detecting that the sky itself shifted against the backdrop of constellations. But long before his calculations, stones and avenues seemed to reveal a creeping mismatch between intended alignments and actual risings. A discrepancy that would have been experienced not as a celestial curiosity, but as a spiritual insult that demanded novel explanations. For the custodians of public fear, knowledge became a kind of currency, and withholding it, timing it, or reshaping it could determine who commanded the rituals, who read the omens, who wore the headdress under the advancing shadow of the moon. And conspiracy grows easily where calendars grant power, because to control the schedule of heaven is to write the script of earth. Somewhere in the desert, a line of standing stones once marked the transit of a star now shifted, and the people who built it may have known that even the firmest sky moves. Only it moves slowly enough to fool a single lifetime. And this slowness is the most exquisite instrument of dread, because it lets error accumulate quietly until it knocks loudly. In China, officials debated whether comets presaged internal corruption or external threat, and the very argument reveals how fear was useful, because a sky message could be translated into a policy memo, responsibility confessed or imposed, and the public fear processed into public order, as long as the translation remained persuasive. In Greece and Rome, philosophers tamed fear with theory and sober diagrams, but farmers and soldiers still stood under an eclipse and felt old instincts rising, the urge to beat pans, light fires, pray, or curse, because the body recognizes the betrayal of day with a speed the mind cannot outpace. And instinct is often a better historian of fear than any surviving text. Even in lands that celebrated the stars as navigational companions, whispers endure about taboos surrounding certain months, certain asterisms, certain risings where journeys pause and songs hush. And in such whispers, one hears not ignorance, but a respect for thresholds, an acceptance that the sky opens gates at its pleasure and closes them just as freely. Maps, lists, temples, and rituals were built not to end fear, but to house it, to give it runes and schedules and caretakers. And in those houses, the night was domesticated without being declawed, because a house cat retains a tiger's dream, and the stars retain a god's verdict. Fear learned the craft of architecture, and the first tall platforms of brick and stone rose from floodplains not as mere viewpoints, but as instruments for confirmation, places where a priest could climb above the sleeping city to perform a negotiation, fires lit on parapets, incense smoothing the air, measured steps along the parapet matching the measured march of the planets, to convince an invisible audience that their needs were being heard. The ziggurat did not only climb toward the sky, it taught the eye to climb, to trace angles from horizon to zenith, to measure and remember. And the act of ascending was itself a ritual of patience, replacing panic with procedure, fear transformed into lists and tables, so thorough that clay could inherit the sky for a little while, and governments could pretend to manage it. Egypt's temple ceilings, dusted with blue and gold, constellations pinned in mesmerizing order, were not decorations so much as safeguards. A net cast over the chaos above, decans distributed hour by hour like an honor guard. And in the slow procession through hypostyle halls, the faithful passed under a rehearsal of dawn that tried to guarantee the actual dawn would not lose its way. The star clocks that priests kept were both instruction and comfort, noting which decan rose in which hour, how long the night had advanced, and while the lists appear clinical to modern readers, one can feel the pulse of anxiety behind them. That if these names were uttered in the right sequence, if this knowledge was kept sharp, the underworld snake would find its teeth dulled by mere words. The Chinese maintained manuals describing how to respond when the sun or moon was eaten, drums to be struck, fires to be lit, proclamations to be made, and the choreography of response functioned as more than a morale exercise. It was a national ritual that reset the moral compass, reminding every village that the empire was awake and listening to heaven's questions. Mesoamerica crafted the most dramatic ritual of calendrical technology, the binding of the years, the new fire ceremony at the end of a 52-year cycle, when all fires were extinguished and the Pleiades reached the meridian at midnight, and under a sky emptied of flame, the world held its breath, waiting for a spark to be kindled in the chest of a sacrificial victim, and carried out to relight every hearth. Fear condensed into one night of exquisite suspense. During that night, the stars were both judge and witness. The Milky Way a river that might reverse, the Pleiades a knot that must pass overhead. And within the collective pause, one senses a civilization negotiating a contract, vowing to renew order if order would agree to be renewed, a negotiation that only a sky could sign. In subterranean sanctuaries of the Roman world, a bull met its mythic end in the hands of a god whose iconography hid a star map. The tauroctony of Mithras, aligning zodiacal symbols in a riddle of seasons and precession, and initiates under a painted dome learned to read the order that kept fear at bay, or at least to believe that order could be baptized into their society. Coins were stamped with stars above temples. Kings set their thrones beneath constellations, and when omens were friendly, rulers rushed to adopt them. Because control of fear includes the right to frame relief, but even celebration is an act of awareness, a way of acknowledging the latent threat that had been, for a moment, transformed into favor without losing its teeth. The ancient scribes who copied omens did more than preserve them. They pruned, clarified, amalgamated, and sometimes altered them to fit new reigns and new conditions. And as those lines of cuneiform or hieroglyphs traveled across centuries, the sky they described became a palimpsest of anxieties, proving that fear, too, has a genealogy. To read an omen is to accept that the world speaks in symbols, and once that grammar is accepted, everything becomes legible and therefore dangerous. For an unpredicted cloud at dawn, a halo around the moon, a star seen at a forbidden hour can tilt the mind until the city tilts with it, and a people become specialists in stabilizing meaning on slippery nights. Secrecy was part of the craft, for in Babylon and Nineveh court astrologers wrote reports not meant for common ears, combining observations with counsel, the raw data of the sky wrapped in advice about which god to appease, which ritual to emphasize, because knowledge without prescription would be dangerous in a different way, and prescription without knowledge, a theater of empty gestures. From time to time, texts disappear, panels break, codices burn, and the missing material becomes a shadow that lengthens, because when a system of managing fear loses a portion of itself, those who inherited the task must improvise, and improvisation in matters of heaven feels like stepping on ice, whose thickness you know only by listening. Even the Antikythera mechanism, pulled from a shipwreck and patient as the sea, seems like a relic of fear tamed into brass, a gear-driven sky predicting eclipses like an oracle that whispers ahead of time. And the very existence of such a machine suggests that someone wanted the heavens to be predictable not simply for the joy of pattern, but for the respite it offered to rulers and subjects alike. Every ritual technology is a promise written in smoke and stone that the next crisis will be met. And in those promises we glimpse the function of dread as a spur to invention, because a society that fears elegantly often builds beautifully. Beyond the language of cycles like crash words that interrupt sentences, the sudden graffiti of meteorites that scar fields and mines, and ancient records of iron from the sky are tinged with both holiness and alarm, because when stones fall from the vault, history briefly wears the raw face of physics without myth to cushion it. Hittite texts speak of cult objects of iron thought to be born of heaven, and in many places meteorites were enthroned or wrapped as if alive, their descent marked by shrines and stories, because to touch the sky is dangerous, but to ignore it is fatal, and so the compromise is veneration with trembling hands. Some scholars see in Baltic and Scandinavian sagas the memory of winter stretched beyond patience, a thimble winter where snow piled like silence. And while climate has many parents, the sky was a convenient one, auroras washing south in curtains like omens made visible, and a long chill amplifying a culture's appetite for stories about cosmic endings that are both feared and courted. The Chinese recorded meteor showers with matter-of-fact clarity. Stars fell like rain, and a bright guest star in 1054, now known to us as the remnant of a supernova in Taurus, hung in the daylight for weeks, while across the world rock art appears with hand suns and crescent moons aligned with a strange star. A coincidence, perhaps, or a communal memory accidentally synchronous, and such alignments keep scholars awake. In the Mediterranean, the myth of Phaethon losing control of the sun's chariot might be a parable only, or it might be a recollection of bolides tearing across the sky, scorching where they fell, stories gathering around scars in the ground, as if the earth itself could remember fire and lines, and memory is most durable when it burns a little. The Kali crater field in Estonia is linked by local legend to a fiery descent, the ground broken in circles like punctuation marks, and later folklore may have synchronized with much older trauma, an echo that refuses to dampen completely, because trauma and awe both carve deep channels for memory to flow through when the sky throws down a stone. Across the Pacific, navigators learned the night like a chant, identifying swells by starlight and stars by swell, traveling thousands of miles with confidence. And yet there were taboos about certain nights and orientations, rules whispered with a seriousness that suggests more than mere caution, a respect for crossings where sky and sea conspire to test a canoe's humility. In West Africa, the Dogon are famous in modern imagination for a supposed hidden knowledge of Sirius and its companion star, a narrative that says more about outsiders and their hunger for secrets than it does about Dogon cosmology. And yet beneath the speculation is a truth that culture and cosmos are braided in ways that resist simple unraveling, and the braid looks like fear when seen from the wrong angle. When empires fall, their star books are among the first objects to be burned or hidden, and the conquest of the Americas unspooled miles of painted glyphs into ash, the Dresden Codex surviving like a leaf that blew sideways. And when pages vanish, so do the instructions for handling dread, leaving descendants to reconstruct from fragments a rite that once held night steady. On another continent, the Qin burned texts to consolidate doctrine, and though the destruction was not aimed solely at astronomical writings, the gesture reveals the politics of knowledge. If the sky confers mandates, then control over its interpreters is part of the art of rule, and the fear of stars becomes the fear of councils that know what those stars intend. The Antikythera gears rusted in salt, the Maya pages blackened in missionary fires, the ash of lost observatories blown into new roofs. And the conspiracy here is not a cabal whispering in a hidden room, but the ordinary momentum of power protecting itself from the destabilizing eloquence of the cosmos, because a populace trained to read an eclipse is also trained to ask who failed to prepare. Out in the Sahara, stones stand in circles at Nabta Playa, their alignments whispering to solstices long past, and their precision implies a patient fear that demanded confirmation over lifetimes, and the fact that the desert has kept their whisper while swallowing their village suggests that devotion to the sky preserves itself, differently than clay vessels or seed granaries can. In cliffs of the American Southwest, a spiral petroglyph is cut with care, a dagger of sunlight passing through it at solstice, and nearby a star and crescent carved together may commemorate an extraordinary sky, or merely a sacred combination of symbols. And the ambiguity is the point, because mystery sustains attention longer than certainty can, and attention is the true currency of fear. Stories cross oceans faster than we expect, and unconnected peoples imagine similar celestial beasts, dragons that eat the sun, wolves that chase dawn, serpents that coil around the world, as if the mind furnished itself with the same furniture to make sense of the same cold room. And even if the details differ, the posture is the same, a reverent flinch that never quite relaxes. Every lost atlas of omens, every broken calendar wheel, every charred ceiling of stars leaves behind a vacuum into which theories flow, some wild, some careful, and the appetite for these theories is a symptom not of ignorance, but of desire. The desire to feel the sky touch the skin again with meaning, even if that touch raises goose flesh. What did they fear when they feared the stars, if not their own reliance on a rhythm that was not theirs to command, a harvest that answered to lights which neither begged nor explained, a body that set its sleep and waking by an authority beyond king and family, with no appeal but ritual and no guarantees beyond pattern? In the unlit hours, the Milky Way looked like a river too wide to ford, and the planets like dignitaries who refused to acknowledge the borders on any map. And the mind, which craves cause and effect, built bridges with myth, laws with calendars, and corridors with architecture, so that survival could be tethered to a choreography that soothed even as it intimidated. Because the price of error was immediate, misreading the sky could mean sowing late, flooding unanticipated, locusts crusting while granaries were thin. And when such mistakes occurred, the temptation to blame a failed rite or a corrupt priest was overwhelming. The cosmos, an uncompromising teacher who never corrected the exam, yet judged the results in public. In that pressure cooker, fear became an instrument, tuned by temple and court, a device to focus attention on the measures that preserved order. And whether or not a ritual prevented an eclipse was less important than whether it synchronized a city's heartbeat in the moment of shadow. And a synchronized heartbeat can carry a people through the shiver that follows a sudden chill at noon. The stars were a ledger of debts, but the night also carried a promise, the repetition of Orion's rising, the return of Sirius, the anchored predictability of northern pointers, so that fear and reassurance braided into a rope sturdy enough to pull a plow or to lift a king. And the rope's beauty lay in its tension, not in any single strand. Sometimes the rope frayed, procession drifting markers away from their original posts, the axis of the world wobbling like a slowed top, and the people at the end of the line felt it without knowing its name, their rights losing their bite, their calendars slipping, their sense of contract with heaven needing a new clause, and the negotiation reopened with anxiety that demanded new mathematics. Even now, in a world lit by screens, we find ourselves startled by a red moon, a bright conjunction, a green comet, and our utilities have their own star fears. Solar storms threatening grids, debris ringing the earth like a careless crown, satellites winking out, and we rediscover in technical language the old unease that the sky is not a ceiling, but a traffic of powers that can blacken cities as easily as they can beautify them. We might comfort ourselves with the precision of apps and ephemerides, but precision does not dissolve significance. It merely gives it a decimal place. And lying back on a dark beach, the same cold river pours over us, the same discouraging distance that turns victories into footnotes and begs the question of how to live under a ceiling that refuses to be a ceiling. Ancient dread was not stupidity, but a field-tested response to an environment where the stakes were agricultural and existential, and the brilliance of the old systems lies in how they used fear to build attention, used attention to build knowledge, and used knowledge to build rituals that made time feel like a companion rather than a pursuer. The conspiracies were not only connivances of priests, but structures of survival, control of calendars, a means to prevent panic, even as some used it to enrich power, and the ambiguity remains. For the same mechanism that tells a people when to celebrate can tell them when to tremble, and the hand that holds the lever is always questioned. If there is a lesson hidden in the glint of those ancient nights, it may be this. To fear the stars is to admit their jurisdiction, to borrow their schedule and accept their corrections, and that humility, when balanced with curiosity, becomes wisdom, a posture that keeps the mind soft enough to learn and the community strong enough to endure. Before you drift into sleep, remember mystery is never truly lost, only waiting to be found. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more relaxing ancient mysteries, and let your curiosity guide you deeper.